Alright, with all the theory out of the way, let's get into some actual Fire Mage gameplay, starting with the opener. In this video, we're going to be showing 3 different openers. One that's more defensive, which you're often going to be looking to use when you're facing compositions that want to run you down, such as double melee and triple DPS, and one that's more aggressive, where peeling really isn't as important, so you can spend more globals on being offensive. And then finally, one with a heavy focus on crowd control and enabling your partners to generate pressure. But before we get into all that, there's a few pre-game rituals we have to go through first as a mage before the gates open, which are applying our arcane intellect, making food for our healer, creating mana gems, using our mana shield for dispel protection, and finally, using an armor. You can often start with Molten Armor as fire in the opener to get the extra crit chance on your first spells, and then swap to Mage or Frost when needed. Now that we have all our buffs up, let's get into our defensive game, which is coming from Hansol, as he faces Ret Unholy Disc as MLP. This composition can do absurd opening damage, so he knows he has to slow it down as much as possible before being aggressive, or his lock is just going to get ran over. Now to do this, he first looks for a blast wave on both the melee players, which allows his teammates to cast some extra spells before the melees can connect. Following this, he looks to apply his critical mass debuff to his kill target by pressing Scorch to increase their crit chance taken by 5%. And then applies a living bomb so he can maintain his consistent damage as he peels. After this, he falls back into spamming Scorch to try and fish for a crit. Notice that he doesn't push into melee range, as he doesn't want to be an easy swap target or be in range for kicks. The priest then pushes into a bad position, so Hansol is able to punish this with a full polymorph. At which point, pushing in for a shatter is a good choice because it's guaranteed value, since the healer's crowd controlled and the damage will be able to force cooldowns. As well as blanketing the Ret Paladins so they can't get value from their wings for a few seconds, which is then followed by a Hammer of Justice from his healer. Having forced Trinket, Hansol decides not to combust and instead go for peels, as he doesn't want his partner to fall over to the pressure of the melee cleave. So he uses Dragon's Breath to stop the gargoyle casting, as well as hitting both the melees, and then follows this up with a Ring of Frost to further prevent damage from going out onto his Warlock on the enemy's cooldowns. Hansol is even able to get a shatter off this ring and force Bubble while his lock is able to fear the healer, due to the pressure Hansol relieved from his crowd controls. After this, Hansol then falls back into farming Scorches to try and grind out a heating up proc so he can go aggressive with his combustion when the opportunity arises. As you see in this opener, Hansol was able to peel a lot of the enemy's cooldowns and allow his teammates to survive while using minimal cooldowns from his peels. It's also important to note that while he was peeling, he was still dealing damage though, which put a lot more pressure on the enemy team than if he was to just spam poly 3 times on each player. The added pressure, along with his peels, put them in a secure spot, while also putting them ahead offensively. Now to compare, we also have an aggressive opener from Venruki here, where he tries to maximize damage done and ends up cleaving the entire enemy team. So to start his opener, he first makes sure to Living Bomb as many targets in his line of sight as possible. This allows him to get great consistent pressure off the bat, while also allowing his stat modifiers like his Cloak and Weapon Enchant to proc. After this, he then Fire Blast to try and fish for a crit, as the enemy have all their kicks up, and casting at this point would get him locked out. Following this sequence, he then fires out a Flame Orb to once again fish for his modifiers, but also to try and farm some impact procs from its ticking damage to reset his Fire Blast cooldowns. He then goes to reapply his Living Bombs as he waits for his Fire Blast cooldown to come back up. And fortunately, because of his Flame Orb, he's able to get an impact proc and send out another Fire Blast to keep fishing for procs, all the while walking into melee to try and get his Nova down for a guaranteed shatter. With no more single target instance to press, Venruki goes for a Blast Wave as it hits multiple targets and therefore has a high chance of giving him an impact proc, before scorching the Boomkin and generating a hot streak from its critical effect, as well as gaining an impact proc. Now that he has a hot streak proc, he goes to shatter it with a cone of cold, which gives him a massive ignite, and follows it up with a living bomb to further buff his combustion, and then sends out his combustion with his 3 dots to generate a huge damage over time effect. And then, using the impact proc he's been sitting on earlier, spreads all his dots from the boomkin to the enemy shaman as well. At this point, he then commits Dragon's Breath to the shaman and watches him tick down to his dots, which is then answered by the shaman's Spirit Link. So as you can see in this opener, because Venruki was able to generate so much pressure from that initial Pyroblast crit and living bombs, he didn't even need to get casted crowd control to force the enemy team low. His offensive positioning of being on top of the enemy team also allowed him to guarantee a shatter when he was able to get a hot streak proc, and allowed him to easily Dragon's Breath as he is already pre-moved to the shaman. Finally, for our last opener, we have one coming in from Zico, which focuses on control. The polar opposite of the last opener because he is playing the setup comp of Rogue Mage. Zico's goals in the opener are to control the healer and allow his rogue to solo the kill target, while adding in some instant pressure of his own as he won't really be able to cast into the 2 ranged specs. To achieve this, Zico starts in stealth and runs towards the enemy healer. Once he reaches the healer, he then places them into a Dragon's Breath and follows up with Ring of Frost since it's instant and therefore unpreventable unless the enemy pre-blanket silences him. Following this, he then looks to crowd control the off DPS target to prevent peels, but is quickly interrupted, and therefore starts dealing instant damage instead to avoid the Warlock's kick, first by using Fire Blast, followed by a Living Bomb. At this point, Zico's crowd control has allowed his rogue to almost solo the mage. So with a quick blind to follow up on the paladin, Zico's team is able to force the healer's trinket without Zico having to commit combustion or really do any damage at all. Now that the CC is over, Zico then looks to work on simply pressuring the mage down by fishing for a hot streak, so he can enter the next phase of the game with a combustion and crowd control on the enemy healer when they have no trinket. Although in this particular instance he's a little too impatient and is luckily able to dispel combustion before the Dragon's Breath lands. So, to conclude on this final opener here, crowd controlling off the bat can be great when playing with melee classes that can ramp damage instantly, as you can force cooldowns without committing damage yourself, although do try and cover your combust on the kill go.